How are you folks? I want to give a small talk about the war in Ukraine. The war that pits Russia against Ukraine. Being a Zimbabwean, a country that waged war against colonialism and had a heavy dose of socialism during the liberation struggle, one would assume that I would quickly go to Russia's defense. But I don't go down like that. Indeed, I had a copy of the Communist Manifesto given to me by two liberation comrades who stayed at our home towards the ceasefire, Comrade Viva and Comrade Miripiri. I grew up liking history and had my fair share of history prizes at school. But it was only after I finished my schooling that I realized that most history is propaganda forced on students by the writers. The topics on the Russian Revolution, on the Chinese Revolution, written at the height of the Cold War, were meant to make people like me side with Russia and China, always. We had to view the Chinese and the Russians as heroes, the people who had helped us in the liberation struggle. But I grew up, and as I grew up, many things changed in my mind, and I refuse to be a victim now, unlike most of my acquaintances who were unfortunately dragged by such historical distortions. This was history made to suit with the one-party state agenda that our government wanted to establish then. Yes, Russia did help us in our liberation struggle, but it wasn't just Russia. It was actually the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which included Ukraine and Georgia and 12 other countries, not just Russia. So why should I side with Russia alone, as if it was the only one siding with us in the liberation struggle? Wasn't Ukraine there? It's like thinking USA is just New York, forgetting all about the other states. To put the story of the Russo-Ukraine war into perspective, I'll start by using an example of two celebrities in love. Let me talk about Kanye West and Kim Kardashian. Kanye, or Ye as he likes to call himself these days, would be like Russia, and Kim, more like Ukraine. The two then get divorced, but Ye does not exactly accept it. He wants all of Kim and can harass her or anyone who wants to take her. He cannot move on, as Kim has done. This, in short, is similar to the story of Ukraine and Russia. In my view, some Russians wanted to remain as the big brother when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, the USSR, collapsed. They must have been hurt by the collapse that the last USSR leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, initiated through his policies like glasnost and perestroika. What seemed like a polygamous affair was dying slowly as the polygamists started getting single as the wives fled one by one. But it's easier to get back to being single if you had just one wife, not 14. So Russia found an excuse to invade one of the Soviet breakaways, one of its former wives, Georgia, in 2008. Needless to say, the war wasn't as easy for Russia, which expected a very quick war. It had such a poor showing. During the Russo-Georgian War, the relation between Russia and Ukraine soured, as Russia accused Ukraine of supporting Georgia through selling it arms. There were also demands that Russia obtain prior permission whenever they crossed the Ukrainian border. Russia did not comply with this. They ignored it. In February 2008, Russia unilaterally withdrew from the Ukrainian-Russian Intergovernmental Agreement on the main Center for Missile Attack Warning, which had been signed in 1997. In October 2008, Putin accused Ukraine of having soldiers in the Georgian war. The Ukrainians denied this accusation. Eventually, it won but with huge setbacks and needed to do some soul-searching. It needed to rebuild its army after this disaster in Georgia. Ukraine wanted to join NATO in 2008, but this was stopped when a pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, came into power. He preferred that Ukraine remain non-aligned but closer to Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union rather than European Union. On 14 August 2013, the Russian Customs Service stopped all goods coming from Ukraine. This was largely viewed as the start of a trade war against Ukraine. Its main aim was to prevent Ukraine from signing a trade agreement with the European Union. The following month, Russia actually warned Ukraine that if it signed a trade agreement with the European Union, Russia would ensure it faces financial catastrophe which would result in the collapse of Ukraine as a state. On 17 December 2013, the Ukraine President Yanukovych stopped his overtures to the EU, turning his attention to working with Russia instead. This resulted in protests by the Ukraine citizens who preferred closer ties with the EU instead of Russia. The Euromaidan protests. Citizens were protesting plans to tie the country closer to Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union instead of the European Union. However, the leader was forced to flee in 2014. The president, Viktor Yanukovych, was ousted in February 2014. This must have angered the Russians, who had their preferred president being chased away, and from there onwards must have started to plan on how to annex Ukraine and put their puppet leader instead. Now get this, soon after he was ousted, on 27 February 2014, unmarked military men wearing masks seized a number of important buildings in Crimea. These were later on discovered to be Russians. On 1 March, the Russian parliament gave Putin authority to use military force in Ukraine. These masked people invaded Crimea following Putin's orders. A new pro-Russian premier was installed and Russia declared that Crimea was now an independent state. It was added to the Russian Federation. Ukraine forces were evicted through protests from Russian forces and pro-Russian protesters. So if you look closely, this had happened after the leader they wanted had been ousted. The leader they believed did not want Ukraine to join the EU, so they had to put their own puppet leaders instead. This was in violation of several agreements that included the Belavesia Accord of 1991, the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurance of 1994, the Helsinki Accords of 1975, and the 1997 Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Partnership between Russia and Ukraine. The Deputy Russian Minister of Finance, Tatiana Nesterenko, said that the decision to annex Crimea was made by Vladimir Putin on his own without consulting his Minister of Finance. Since 2014, when Russia took over Crimea, there had been an even stronger build-up of Russian soldiers across the Ukraine borders. This meant that their invasion had not ended. They were waiting to find another chance to get more from Ukraine. Hostilities between the two armies increased. Several agreements in military as well as trade terms were cancelled between the two countries, mostly after the Crimea War. This even includes the banning of artists from entering Ukraine from Russia. The Russians, on the other hand, were also helping several separatist groups in Ukraine whom they had sponsored to fight against the Ukraine government. On 26 November 2018, for instance, there was a firing upon and seizure of Ukrainian naval ships by Russia. In March 2021, it was noted that large military equipments were being moved from Russia to places in Ukraine such as Crimea, Rostov, and the Voronezh Oblasts. The troops were numbered around 90,000. What was this for? The Russians claimed the troops posed no threat. leaders like the German Chancellor Angela Merkel phoned Putin asking him to stop the build-up, but he would not. And he would not say why he was doing so. Wasn't this the chance to tell the world what was going on? By November 2021, 100,000 Russian troops were placed along the Russian-Ukraine border. Then, on 21 February 2022, Russia moved into Ukraine through the separatist regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, claiming it was part of a peacekeeping operation. These separatist regions are mostly sponsored by Russia and sometimes include Russian military personnel. Putin never told his people he was going to war because Ukraine was getting cozy with NATO. Initially, he lied to his people that he was simply having a special mission to defend Russian-speaking people in Ukraine against some people whom he called neo-Nazis or fascists, whom he said were persecuting the Russian-speaking people. But why was it his duty to remove fascists from other countries instead of his? The mind boggles. Both the president and the prime minister of Ukraine are Jews. So how can they be neo-Nazi? These are the very victims of neo-Nazis. So how can they be? This was clearly a lie from Putin. In the process, the tune again changed. This was when suddenly Putin seemed to realize that the NATO issue would gain him support, so he changed and started using it as a justification to gain currency. Putin only talked about his opposition to Ukraine joining NATO on a televised broadcast this year on 21 February when his troops were already in Ukraine, the day they invaded Ukraine for the second time. So, this talk about Putin being against Ukraine joining NATO is just hot air. These were not the reasons he preferred when his troops were milling around the Ukraine border and when his troops were getting into Ukraine. He only said it days later after they had already entered Ukraine. With Ukraine, Putin hoped for a quick and easy victory within a week. This has not been so. This may turn out to be a very long war. Why didn't Russia seek redress with the UN on whatever issues it felt it had with the Ukraine? Isn't this one of the main reasons the United Nations was created? Why not go to the United Nations and give them your problem so that they solve it? And if they fail, you tell the whole world that the United Nations has failed. Plus, there are also other bodies it would have channeled its grievances. First things first, before going for the jugular, before attacking Ukraine. If Russia did seek redress to any of those bodies, then let it show the world that it did, but there was no help forthcoming. Hence it decided to go into combat. And talking about the UN, there was a recent vote on Russia at the United Nations. The results were surprising. Voting by the UN member countries had an interesting result. Not because countries like China and Zimbabwe decided to visit the bathroom on the time of voting, but because most of the former Russian colleagues in the USSR did as well. Of the 15 former USSR states, only Russia itself, as expected, voted for itself, and its closest buddy, Belarus. Other former USSR countries such as Georgia, Latvia, Moldova, Lithuania, Estonia actually voted against Russia. This is how much it is hated by its own neighbors, its former colleagues. It should ask itself why its former colleagues are preferring to join the EU instead of trading with Russia. What did it do or not do that makes colleagues prefer former rivals instead of Russia herself? In fact, some of the former USSR colleagues like Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania are actually part of NATO now, while Georgia and Ukraine want in. Interesting enough, Russia itself sometimes works together with the same NATO. Putin himself wanted to join NATO in his early days in power and was once offended by the then NATO Secretary General, Lord George Robertson, after he had asked when exactly NATO was going to invite Russia to join, only to be told by Robertson that Russia like everyone else, was supposed to apply for membership. First things first. In 1997, a NATO-Russia Founding Act was made. This act actually states boldly that Russia and NATO are not enemies, and in fact would work together well, always. They would cooperate even on security matters. It left a chance to make Russia a member of NATO if need be. A further agreement was done in 2002, the NATO-Russia Council. This allowed Russia access and a permanent presence at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium. This council meets regularly. So why would Russia fear if Ukraine joined NATO? After all, it would see that if NATO was going to bomb it, it had a permanent presence at NATO headquarters. It would see that this was going to happen before it had happened. This was more like joining NATO itself. So why worry about another country joining NATO? Countries like Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Moldova formed the Guama, a name springing from their initials in 1997. This came after the realization that they could not work with Russia. The main purpose of Guama was to harmonize as well as integrate the commercial, diplomatic, and democratic relations of the four countries. Some tried to justify the Russian invasion by dangling the Warsaw Pact, which is now defunct. The Warsaw Pact was created in 1955 and included all USSR countries and other countries too. Countries like Bulgaria, East Germany, Romania, and Poland. This pact has since collapsed, and some of the countries in it are now part of NATO. It collapsed in 1991. Countries like Albania, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria are some of the Warsaw Pact colleagues now in NATO. It never had a clause that said no former partner would join rival organizations like NATO. That's a misleading myth. It is a lie being peddled by those who support dictators like Putin. It's revisionist history. Why is it being raised now? Yet since 1991, countries from the pact have been joining NATO, with no one invoking the so-called part of the agreement that says they should not. This is if ever there is such a part in the Warsaw Pact, which is very doubtful. In fact, we need to know that the then leader of the USSR was Mikhail Gorbachev, who in 2014, marking the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall that divided Germany between East and West, said that there was never a discussion about former Warsaw Pact members not joining NATO. You get that? There was never such a discussion. A former Russian leader, Boris Yeltsin, wrote to former USA President Bill Clinton a letter in 1993 that noted, "Any possible integration of East European countries into NATO will not automatically lead to the alliance somehow turning against Russia." You hear that? So, the fears that Russia, by allowing Ukraine to have NATO inside it, will put Russia at risk are unfounded. There are some NATO countries close to Russia already, and nothing has been done to them, and neither has Russia itself protested. In fact, the USA itself is very close geographically to Russia through Alaska. It is only less than 80 kilometers away. Not only is Alaska close to Russia, but there are also two islands belonging to the United States of America that are even closer to Russia. America could simply put its missiles there. If it wanted to do anything to Russia, surely it wouldn't have to go through Ukraine, but use Alaska, a part of which borders with Russia. But the other thing that we forget is, with the advancement of technology, we now have missiles that are very fast and can be fired from anywhere in this world and reach their target within seconds, within minutes. So it's not about the distance where the missiles are. It's not about how far a country is. It's not about how near a country is or how far a country is to fire a missile. We have missiles that have more than just supersonic speed these days. So even if fired from Zimbabwe, they can reach anywhere, quick, fast, and in a hurry. To make things worse, there are several protests in Russia against the war. including protests by children. But Putin is treating all protesters harshly. He's arresting them. He has even made laws that say that if anyone reports on false news about Russia, and by the word false meaning news that puts Russia in a negative light, he or she should have committed a criminal offense and was to spend even up to 15 years in jail. This is very sad and very undemocratic of Putin. There has also been an outcry about the ban on sports persons in Russia. It is indeed painful. I feel for the sports persons myself, but maybe these people also need to speak up against the war. Maybe their leaders will hear them more. After all, it will be an awkward situation for them to keep participating while their counterparts in Ukraine are under heavy shelling from the country Russia, and thus cannot train or participate in any sporting activities. That there are several Russians protesting despite their being arrested is an important gesture and goes to show who's wrong in this issue. And hopefully the celebrities and sportspersons will also participate. The people of Ukraine have united against this invasion. We have seen their celebrities, who include sportspersons, beauty models, all sacrificing everything they have to join this war to defend their land. This just goes to show how important the war is to every Ukrainian. It isn't just President Zelensky's war. It is for every Ukrainian. It is for everyone who likes human rights, who likes democracy. Russia hates opposition and has even jailed some opposition leaders such as Alexei Navalny. This has made it a darling of many people who like dictators. They use Russia's blueprint. In fact, Russia is one country that protects dictators at the UN and vetoes against anything meant to stop one from being a dictator. Those who love dictators in any country have put their support on Putin. Countries ruled by well-known dictators who hold fake democratic elections to deceive the international community, like Putin does, have supported Putin. A close look at how countries recently voted on the Russian issue at the UN shows that all countries that do not hold democratic elections mostly supported him or chose to abscond. As I pen off, I would like to talk about propaganda. Some say the West churns out a lot of propaganda, but who doesn't? The East does the same. As we speak, it's doing it. It's even censoring anti-Russian broadcasts, the same accusation being thrown to the West. Interesting enough, the same Russia, through internet manipulation, assisted Donald Trump win an election in America not so long ago. Maybe their main idea is to have leaders who are his puppets throughout the world. But imagine a world dominated by dictators. It would be a sad world, bringing us back to the absolute monarchy years. This should be stopped. This is why I'm against the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. The main intention of Russia is to put a puppet leader in Ukraine. I hope this fails.